The year was 1857, and the town of Ashcroft, Georgia, seemed to sleep beneath an endless veil of fog. The marshlands surrounding it exhaled a sour scent of decay, and the oak trees along the winding dirt roads carried Spanish moss that hung like the tattered veils of widows. There were few who ventured out at dusk, for the swamps whispered things that no one cared to understand. The townsfolk had learned to live quietly, to pray softly, and to bury their dead quickly. Among those who lived on the edge of this silence was Eleanor Whitfield, a widow not yet 30, whose husband, Captain Thomas Whitfield, had been taken by fever during the summer's heat. Their house stood at the farthest edge of the county, a two-story plantation home left to rot slowly since his passing. The shutters rattled in the wind, the wooden steps groaned like weary bones. Every morning Eleanor rose before the sun, walked through the overgrown garden, and stood before the grave that lay at the base of the weeping willow. There, beneath soil damp with southern rain, her husband rested, or so the preacher had said. Yet the widow often whispered as if he still listened. Thomas had been everything the town respected, disciplined, devout, commanding. Yet after his death, Eleanor's composure dissolved. Some nights, the neighbors claimed to see a candle burning long past midnight in her upper window. Others swore they heard voices, soft, pleading, then angry, carried on the wind. No one dared to ask her about it. They only watched, crossing themselves whenever her carriage passed through town for supplies. By late autumn, the loneliness began to gnaw at her like a fever. The walls creaked with sounds that no logic could explain. Sometimes she would wake to find the parlor door wide open, though she remembered locking it. Sometimes her husband's Bible, the one that used to rest beside his bed, appeared on the kitchen table with its pages turned to verses about resurrection, and sometimes, when the wind was low and the moon was thin, Eleanor swore she could hear breathing beside her as she slept. One afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the cypress trees, Eleanor received a visit from Reverend Harlan, a thin man with a voice that cracked like old wood. He came to bring comfort, or so he said. "You've been keeping to yourself, Mrs. Whitfield," he murmured, adjusting his hat at the door. "Solitude breeds dangerous thoughts. Perhaps it's time you returned to the congregation." Eleanor offered him tea in a cracked porcelain cup and smiled faintly. "I pray every night, Reverend, more than ever before." He studied her face, the hollow eyes, the pale skin, the faint tremor in her hands. "And what is it you pray for?" She looked toward the window, where the graveyard lay beyond the willow's drooping arms, for him to answer. That night, as rain beat against the windows, Eleanor walked barefoot into the garden, clutching a lantern and the same Bible that had moved of its own accord days before. Her dress dragged through the mud, her hair clung to her face. The grave mound glistened under the stormlight. She knelt beside it and whispered, "If you take everything from me, at least let me keep his blood." Her voice trembled, lost between prayer and blasphemy. "If love is holy, then let it not die." Lightning split the sky, illuminating her shadow across the gravestone, and for one flicker of a moment she thought she saw another shadow beside her, all familiar, watching. She gasped, dropped the lantern, and the flame hissed into darkness. The next morning she woke on the parlor floor, unsure how she had returned inside. Mud caked her feet. The lantern lay shattered beside her. When she went to the window she saw footprints. One set hers, another leading away from the grave, larger, deeper, ending halfway across the yard as if whoever walked had vanished into the mist. For days afterward she could not rest. The air in the house felt heavier, carrying a faint scent of earth and candle smoke. Once, as she walked down the hall, she heard the floorboards groan beneath invisible steps. In the nursery, a room untouched since Thomas's death, she found the cradle swaying gently. Her heart clenched. There had never been a child. Their dreams of one had died with him, yet the cradle kept moving, as if something unseen had brushed past it. She touched it with trembling fingers, and the rocking stopped. Eleanor began to lose her sense of time. The fog thickened around the estate, shrouding the road so completely that travelers passed by without ever seeing the gate. It was as though the house had been erased from the world. The servants had long since left. She lived now with silence and memory, and something else, some presence that hovered between grief and hunger. One evening, a letter arrived without a rider, sealed with black wax. It bore no name. Inside was a single sheet of parchment, written in a hand she recognized, her husband's. Eleanor, it read, "Our promise was never to be broken. Meet me where the roots drink deepest." The words trembled in her hands. The ink smelled faintly of the soil near the grave. That night she returned to the willow. The air was thick, unmoving. Fireflies glimmered like dying stars. She carried a spade, though she could not remember deciding to bring it. Her breath fogged in the cold as she knelt once more before the grave. She dug. Each strike of the spade sounded louder than thunder in her ears. When the blade struck wood, she stopped. The coffin lay beneath, slick with moisture. Her heart pounded so violently that it hurt. Slowly she pried open the lid. Inside was not decay, not the black ruin of months in the ground. There was flesh, pale, almost luminous, and eyes that shone faintly open. His mouth curved in what could have been a smile, or a grimace of something still alive. She stumbled backward, choking on a scream that never left her throat. The body moved, or perhaps the shadows only shifted, but the illusion was too real to dismiss. The ground seemed to pulse, the air humming with something ancient. She fled inside, clutching the letter against her chest, her mind unraveling in spirals of disbelief. For the next few days the grave remained untouched. She dared not return, yet strange things began to appear around the house, muddy footprints leading from the door to the nursery, a child's toy that had never been there before, and a voice, small, delicate, humming a lullaby she did not know. When she followed the sound, it always ended at the closed nursery door. She began to speak to it through the wood, whispering prayers, apologies, and finally names. "Thomas," she would murmur, "is that you, or is it the child we never had?" At times she thought she heard laughter in response, a soft, gurgling sound like that of an infant learning to breathe. One dawn, when the fog was at its thickest, Elena woke to find the nursery door open. The cradle rocked gently. Inside it lay something wrapped in linen, its shape small but unmistakably human. Her breath caught as she stepped closer. The bundle moved. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and peeled back the cloth. What she saw was neither dead nor living. A child pale as candle wax, eyes black and unblinking, its tiny mouth opening as if to speak her name. Her heart broke and mended in the same moment. Tears streamed down her face as she lifted the infant into her arms. Its skin was cold, but not lifeless. The child's heartbeat, faint and irregular, pulsed against her wrist. She whispered, "You're mine," and for the first time in months she felt warmth flood her chest. She did not question, she did not pray. She only held it close, rocking it as thunder murmured far away. Outside, the willow swayed without wind, and the grave beneath it began to sink, as if the earth itself bowed in submission. The neighbors would later claim they heard a woman singing that night, a voice soft and haunting, carried miles through the fog. None dared approach. By morning the sun rose over Ashcroft, but the Whitfield house stood dark, its shutters drawn, its chimney cold. Only the faint sound of a lullaby lingered in the still air, mingling with the scent of wet soil and lilies. In town, the Reverend would find another letter days later, placed upon the church steps. Its writing was precise but trembling. "He has returned, and with him the child that was promised. The grave is only a doorway for those who know how to knock." Beneath it, in place of a signature, was a smear of ash and something that looked like a fingerprint, too small to belong to an adult. And so the stories began, of the widow who defied heaven and death, of the child born from a grave, of the house that none could find once the fog rolled in. But somewhere deep within the marshlands of Georgia, when the night was still and the moon drowned behind the clouds, travelers swore they saw a lantern moving slowly between the trees, carried by a woman in black, cradling something that whispered her name. The days following that night unfolded like a fever dream. The fog that once clung gently to the Whitfield estate now thickened into something more suffocating, sealing Elena within a world that no longer obeyed the rules of reason. She hardly ate, rarely slept, and spoke only in murmurs to the small figure that never left her sight. To anyone else, it might have seemed she held nothing at all, but in her trembling arms, Elena saw her child, warm, breathing, alive. The house had become her universe. She wandered its corridors like a restless ghost, her candle flickering against the peeling wallpaper. Sometimes she paused at the nursery door and whispered lullabies through cracked lips. Sometimes she laughed softly, almost tenderly, before her voice broke into tears. The servants who had once dared to return for their wages fled again after a single day, claiming the widow spoke to shadows and cursed anyone who mentioned her husband's grave. Rumors began to spread through Ashcroft. Some said Elena had lost her mind to grief. Others whispered that she had found comfort in darker prayers, that she'd turned her face from the church and given her soul to something old as the swamp. Reverend Harlan tried once more to visit her, but when he reached the edge of the property, he swore the air itself turned colder. He saw movement behind the curtains, a figure standing at the window, cradling what looked like a bundle wrapped in white linen, and he left without knocking. Inside, Elena's world had narrowed to the rhythm of her own heartbeat and the faint cooing she swore she heard. She spoke to the child as she rocked in the old wooden chair by the fire. "They won't understand," she whispered. "They never did, but you and I, we are proof that love cannot be buried." She pressed her lips to the air as if kissing a tiny forehead. The wind outside howled in response, rattling the shutters. As winter crept closer, the house began to betray her. The roof leaked, the floorboards sagged, and cold drafts slithered through unseen cracks, but she felt no fear, only defiance. The fire burned day and night. She lived by its light and the lull of her imagination. Still, something deeper stirred beneath that fragile calm, doubt. In moments when exhaustion overtook her, when her eyelids drooped and reality softened, she would glance toward her arms and see only emptiness. No weight, no warmth. Then she'd gasp, clutching the space where the child had been, whispering desperate reassurances into the void until the illusion returned. Her nights were worse. The house grew restless when the moon rose. Doors creaked open on their own, and the air seemed to hum faintly, like a low note from a distant choir. Sometimes she heard a voice, her husband's voice, calling from the garden, gentle but commanding. "Elena." It came from beyond the window, from where the willow swayed. She would rise, trembling, step barefoot onto the wet grass, and search the darkness. There was never anyone there, only the grave, silent and sunken. Only the sound of her own ragged breathing. On the 15th night of December, she woke to a knock at the door. The sound echoed through the hall like thunder. It was past midnight, the hour when the fog was thickest. She hesitated, clutching her shawl around her shoulders. Another knock, louder this time. "Mrs. Whitfield." It was the voice of Deputy Miller, one of the few townsmen brave enough to approach the property. "The Reverend sent me. Are you all right, ma'am?" She hesitated, staring at the door handle as if it might bite her. The child, yes, the child, seemed to stir in her arms. "We're fine." She whispered to it, then called out louder, "Go away. There's no need." "Please, ma'am," the deputy said. The Reverend's worried. "You haven't been seen in weeks." Something inside her snapped. "You think I'm mad," she shouted. "You think I'm wicked because I've kept what was mine." Her voice trembled between fury and hysteria. The deputy hesitated on the porch. Then he said softly, "Mrs. Whitfield, may I come in?" Silence. Then slowly she opened the door. The lantern in his hand threw a yellow glow across her face. She looked thinner than memory, eyes hollow but fever bright. The room behind her smelled of smoke and damp wood. "There's no sickness here," she said flatly. "No sin, only love." His gaze drifted past her to the cradle beside the fire. You have a child?" he asked, uncertain. Eleanor's smile faltered. "Our child," she whispered. "Thomas and mine." The deputy swallowed hard. "Ma'am, your husband's been gone near half a year." Her expression twisted. "Do you think death ends what God never forbade?" He stepped closer, gently, as though she were a wounded animal. "Mrs. Whitfield, please, let me help you." But as he reached for the cradle, Elena lunged forward, screaming, "Don't touch him." The deputy stumbled back, knocking over the lantern. Fire splashed across the rug, catching the drapes in seconds. The room filled with choking smoke. Elena froze, eyes wide, clutching the empty air where she thought her child was. "Ma'am, we have to go," the deputy shouted, grabbing her arm. But she fought him, shrieking, "He'll burn, you'll kill him." Flames climbed the walls, devouring the old house's timber bones. At last, the deputy dragged her outside into the cold mud. She collapsed, coughing, staring at the fire consuming her home. In the glow, she saw the window of the nursery, saw the cradle silhouetted against the flames, and for a single, impossible instant, she thought she saw movement. A small shape, sitting upright, turning its head toward her. She screamed, wrenching free of the deputy's grip, and ran back toward the fire. He caught her at the door, but she fought like a wild thing, crying, "My baby's in there, he's waiting." "Mrs. Whitfield, there's nothing inside," he shouted. "There never was." His words cut through the roar of the fire. She froze. The world seemed to tilt, the sound of the flames fading into silence. For the first time, she looked down at her arms and saw only ashes clinging to her skin. Her face crumpled. "No," she whispered. "He was real." The deputy pulled her away as the roof collapsed, the flames swallowing everything. She screamed until her voice broke, then fell to her knees in the dirt. Behind her, the house of Whitfield fell to ruin, its windows glowing like the eyes of something dying at last. By dawn, only smoke and cinders remained. The Reverend found her sitting beside the ruins, hair tangled, eyes staring at nothing. When he tried to speak, she only murmured, "He's safe now." The fire baptized him. They said she never spoke again after that. Some claimed she was taken to an asylum in Savannah, where she spent her remaining years rocking an invisible child. Others said she vanished one night, the same way her house had vanished into the fog. And though Ashcroft tried to forget her, on quiet nights the townsfolk still swore they saw a faint light moving through the marsh, a lantern's glow, and the sound of a woman's voice, soft and broken, singing a lullaby to someone no one could see. Spring came to Ashcroft in 1858, gentle and indifferent to what it had buried. The land around the old Whitfield estate bloomed again, wildflowers pushing through the ashes of what had once been walls. Travelers who passed the road slowed when they saw the ruins, half expecting to glimpse the woman who had haunted so many whispers, but there was only wind and the faint smell of smoke that the rain could never quite wash away. The fire had taken nearly everything: records, photographs, relics of a family that once commanded respect. What it left behind was a legend and a handful of questions. The deputy who had dragged Elena from the burning house resigned soon after. He told the Reverend that, in her last moments of clarity, she'd begged him not to open the cradle. He hadn't dared to tell her it had been empty all along. The Reverend wrote to a sanatorium in Savannah, and within a week she was gone from Ashcroft, carried away on a carriage at dawn, staring out the window with the blank calm of a person whose soul had already left her body. For months the town tried to forget, yet the story persisted, spreading from porch to tavern, changing with every telling. Some called her possessed, others a victim of loneliness and God's silence. Only Reverend Harlan held fast to the truth, though it tormented him more than any ghost. He had visited her twice in Savannah. The asylum was a tall, pale building that smelled of iron and lavender. Elena's room was small, the window barred, the walls bare. She sat by the corner, humming softly to herself, arms folded as if still holding something precious. "Mrs. Whitfield," he had said, keeping his voice low. "Do you remember me?" She'd looked up with eyes like glass. "You came too late," she answered. "He's safe now." The doctors spoke of her condition with the cool detachment of men who had seen too many tragedies. Hysterical grief, they called it, prolonged bereavement resulting in delusions, quite common among women who suffer sudden loss and isolation. They said the child she believed she carried had been an invention of her mind, something her heart needed so badly it created its own evidence. When her husband died, her body had miscarried a child she never knew she was carrying. The shock, the guilt, the loneliness, all of it fermented into madness. Every sound she'd heard, every footprint she'd seen, every whisper she'd sworn was his voice. They were the echoes of a mind trying to rewrite reality. When the Reverend left that day, he stood in the asylum garden for a long time, watching the rain gather in puddles. He wanted to curse the silence of heaven, but he couldn't bring himself to. He had preached that faith was a shield. Now he wondered if it could also be a weapon, cutting the hearts of those who clung to it too tightly. Back in Ashcroft, the world moved on. The estate was sold to a merchant from Savannah who tore down what remained and built a mill. The willow tree was cut for lumber, and the grave beneath it was moved to the churchyard. When the coffin was opened for reburial, the men found only bones and a scrap of cloth that had once been part of a woman's dress. Perhaps the fire had unearthed her grief even there. Years passed. The war came and left, taking more sons and husbands than any fever ever had. New houses rose, new families prayed in the same church where Eleanor's name was never spoken aloud. Only in the oldest corners of town did people still recall the widow who had loved too fiercely to let death finish its work. In 1863, Reverend Harlan received a letter written in careful, uncertain handwriting. The seal was the same asylum crest. She passed peacefully. It read, In her final moments she seemed lucid. She asked for her husband's Bible and requested that we sing Rock of Ages. Then she smiled and said, "He's waiting for me by the willow." The Reverend wept quietly when he read it. He'd long stopped believing in hauntings, but he couldn't help imagining her there, in that overgrown garden where the tree no longer stood, her grief at last emptied of sound. He asked for her body to be returned to Ashcroft, and she was buried beside the church wall, not far from where her husband's new grave lay. On the stone he had engraved only 3 words, she believed still. The years thinned memory, as they always do. By the turn of the century, her story had become folklore, told by candlelight to frighten children into obedience. They said the widow had raised a child from the grave, that she danced with spirits, that her house still appeared in the fog to those who wandered too far from the road. No one spoke of the loneliness that truly killed her, or the quiet cruelty of a world that left her alone in it. Sometimes on spring evenings, when the wind carried the scent of rain through the marsh, the church bell would echo strangely, soft drawn out almost like a lullaby. The townsfolk would close their shutters then, muttering that it was only the wind. But Reverend Harlan, now an old man, would stand by the window of his rectory and listen. He knew it wasn't a ghost, it was memory itself, whispering through the reeds, the echo of a woman who had loved too much to survive it. He thought often of her last words, "He's waiting for me by the willow." It had not been a delusion, he decided, nor madness. It was faith, stripped of reason, naked and raw. The same faith that built churches and buried men in its name. The same faith that destroyed her. On the night he died, the Reverend's nurse said she found him smiling, a small wooden cross clutched in his hand. Outside, the wind stirred through the pines, carrying the faintest sound of a woman's voice. But it wasn't eerie nor haunting, it was sorrow softened by time, a lullaby fading into peace, and so the story ended where it began, not in horror, but in the quiet tragedy of a heart that mistook grief for a miracle. The grave had never opened, the dead had never returned, but love, as the Reverend once said in his sermons, is a kind of haunting all its own.